of India.
We spoke about the migration that's happening as a result of climate change. But before I want you to talk about the migration specifically from the Sundarbans and the demographic change it's bringing in, which in turn will bring in a political change undoubtedly. I also want to use this platform that ABP has so kindly given me to talk also about how on this chair last year I had a similar conversation with Dr. Sonam Wangchuk. And he talked about how climate change is real and how it's impacting them in Ladakh every day. And as some of you may know, he has been on a protest of sorts, was house arrested. We sat right here and had this conversation, Dr. Ghosh. And I have to give due credit to ABP Network for really not just ticking the box on climate change, and thank you for that, Avinash, and your team. You are really doing something about it by making these uncomfortable conversations happen. And while the need for a correspondent in the Sundarbans is something that I will leave for them to do something about, but the conversation we had last year is being followed up this year with you, Dr. Ghosh. And I think that is a start. We have to acknowledge the elephant in the room before we can do anything about it. And any precursor to change is discussion, dialogue, debate. We're past the stage of debate, fortunately, on climate change because it is real. But congratulations to you all, the ABP Network, for doing this and for enabling conversations like this. So on that note, can we talk about the migration that we were talking about back in the speaker lounge, Dr. Ghosh, the migration that climate change is causing and its ensuing socio-economic and political impact?
Yes, certainly. And yes, I'm very glad to be here, and I'm grateful to ABP for inviting me, and most of all for their paying attention to this subject. You know, the difficulty with climate change is that climate change doesn't always manifest itself in extreme events. Rather, it's what has been called slow violence. You know, people are driven slowly from their lands over long periods of time. And an incredible demographic shift has occurred in India, which unfortunately passes largely unnoticed. You know, I had a house in Goa for many, many years. And in the time that I had this house, it was in a small village in Goa, you know, quite sort of removed from Panjim and so on. But I saw over 20 years this incredible demographic shift take place, whereby all the working people in this village were Bengalis. You know, when I first went there, you would never see a Bengali there. But today, the entire working class, all the Malis, all the house painters, all the masons are Bengalis. And either they're Bengalis or they're from Jharkhand, and a certain number from Odisha. But this has happened all the way along the west coast, and it's passed largely unnoticed. You know, this is the case also in Kerala. It's the case in, you know, just up and down the west coast. There are schools now in Bangalore where there are more Bengali-speaking children than Kannada-speaking children. And you can be sure that these will have very large repercussions. You know, these movements will have large demographic and political repercussions in the long run. And yet, I never see this covered, you know. And I don't understand why this passes so unnoticed, you know. In my particular case, I see it also elsewhere. You know, Italy is a country that I've been visiting, you know, for the last 30, 40 years. And beginning in about 1999, I began to notice that everywhere you go in Italy, now you hear Bangla everywhere. You see large groups of Bengalis all over Italy, but most of all you see them in Venice. You know, the entire working class of Venice now is Bengali speaking. And this was, you know, so striking to me, because not only are they Bengali speaking, they don't speak the standard Bangla of Kolkata. They speak the language I used to speak with my grandmother, you know. This is the language of Shariatpur and Madaripur in Bangladesh. So, you know, I started having conversations with a lot of these immigrants, and, you know, they're almost entirely Bangladeshi. And it was very, very fascinating to me to learn how they've made these incredibly dangerous, long journeys across the Mediterranean, across Turkey, into Europe. This is same is true in America, on the streets of Brooklyn now. You know, I hear Bangla being spoken all the time. All the people who repair houses are Bangladeshis now. So, you know, literally in my lifetime, I have seen this incredible demographic change occurring in front of my eyes, where, you know, Bangla, which never used to be widely spoken in cities like New York, now is spoken everywhere.
And that is attributable to climate change?
It's not attributable only to climate change, but certainly it's a very large part of it. You know, so in 2016, 2017, I spent a long time doing research, you know, in the migrant camps in Italy. And I was very struck by the number of Bengalis there, but also Punjabis, but Punjabis from Pakistan. Because the Punjabis from Pakistan who've been displaced have been displaced by floods. You know, the Jhelum floods, the Indus floods, and so on. But also the Bangladeshis, many of them have been displaced by floods. But that's not the only thing. You know, there's also many political factors, economic factors, and so on. But what's very striking, actually, is that Bangladesh is today a very prosperous country. You know, their GDP has per capita has surpassed ours. They have some of the best outcomes in terms of health, etc. And yet, people are leaving there in droves.
I think that's the migration and as a fallout of the larger impact of climate change is definitely something that is happening, and it's happening slowly, and we're not acknowledging it. But another thing that we don't adequately talk about, because to some extent it is gaslit, is the climate impact of capitalism. So yesterday there were a few conversations here, starting with the inaugural session which Veer Sanghvi conducted with Madam Liz Truss. And she spoke about how capitalism as an experiment automatically ensuring freedom and democracy has failed. Clearly, capitalism as an economic experiment ensuring safeguarding our climate has also failed. Do you want to talk about how capitalism destroys climate change in a way, and that there is no compassionate capitalism?
Yeah, I mean, as it's often said, capitalism is the greatest market failure of all time, you know, especially in relation to climate change. You know, how can you actually expect people who are told that greed is good, and people who are told that, you know, just go out there and make money for your shareholders, to care about the environment or to care about, you know, the land? And they obviously don't. So, you know, a lot of capitalists, you know, they talk a lot of greenwashing. I should say here that, you know, actually one of the really amazing things about, let's say, Mr. Narayan Murthy, is that, you know, he founded a company which actually was not harming the environment, you know, which was not in that sense predatory, you know. I remember once, I was actually flying out of Bangalore, and I was looking at the New York Times, and on the same day, the CEOs of American companies were revealed to be earning these fantastical sums of money. And on that same day, they had a little news article about Infosys, where the top officers refused to take more money. You know, and I was very struck by that there was this kind of really great difference. So certainly I think that generation of entrepreneurs like Mr. Narayana Murthy and so on, they have shown a different path. And I think if they were to really engage with these issues on a large scale, maybe they could make a difference. But unfortunately, what we see today is that India has wholeheartedly adopted this model of a kind of extractivism in relation to the environment, which is going to lead to absolute disaster. You can just see it. I mean, you look at, right now, sitting here in Bombay, the coastal road, you know, which is going ahead despite the fact that we know that this coast is incredibly threatened by sea level rise. You know, so that this road, no matter what happens within the next 10, 15 years, it's going to be very badly impacted, you know. It's going to be completely exposed to the impacts of sea level rise, of intensification of cyclones and so on. And yet it's going ahead. And why is it going ahead? I have a theory about it, which is everywhere you look in India, actually this is true all over the world, everywhere you look, there's some giant building going up. And I think the huge push for this comes from the cement lobby. The cement lobby is actually one of the most powerful in the world. I mean, the real estate lobbies, the cement lobbies, and they're pushing the building of dams, and dams are just giant blocks of cement, So all these forms of development, or so-called development, I think will in the long run prove to be catastrophic.
So what you're essentially saying is that we are compromising the long-term stability of our ecosystem for short-term, short-sighted development goals. Would that be an accurate summary of what you said?
Absolutely, yes.
But let's go a little long-term backwards into history. Colonialism. You write about how colonialism essentially also triggered and started what we now today identify as climate change. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes, certainly. I should say that the clearest examples of this actually come from the Americas and Australia, and actually from Europe itself. So beginning in the 17th century, when the Europeans were conquering huge territories in North and South America, they started these massive environmental interventions. So all of, say, the northeast of America was re-engineered to look like Britain. So that's why
New England and words like cities that are called London, New London.
New London, New York, and so on and so forth.
Of course, New York. I never made that connection.
They were all being rebuilt. And before it was New York, it was New Amsterdam. So, it was all being re-engineered. And this was a project that they implemented on a massive scale. America is the most re-engineered landscape in the world, So all the grasslands of the Midwest were torn down, turned into these monocultures. California, which was largely a desert area, was turned into something altogether different. This was by re-engineering the Colorado River, for example. So the long-term effect of this is now being felt. The most endangered parts of America are the parts that have been most extensively engineered. California, you've seen over the last few years, it's either being flooded or is going up in flames. And this is true of the entire West Coast. If you think of Southeast Australia, it's the same thing.
Dr. Ghosh, speaking of re-engineering, I think I want to step back a little bit to reiterate the gaslighting that has happened, that we don't realize or are conscious of. When one thinks of colonial-triggered climate change, what is the first thought that comes to your mind? To my mind, it's South America and the loss of the rainforests and the loss of the biodiversity. I don't think of North America as a casualty of colonialism and of capitalism. And that is the extent to which it's been gaslit. We have no idea it's happened. And I think that again entwines itself into capitalism somewhere. Because colonialism and capitalism, to a large extent, are entwined.
Absolutely. I think that's part of what we forget. And we also forget when we look at America, essentially we are given a certain version of the history, If you look at America from the point of view of the indigenous peoples, or if you look at America from the point of view of black people, it's a completely different history. Because right now the people who are in the so-called sacrifice zones in America are mainly indigenous and black people. So, for example, the Mississippi Delta, which is another very massively re-engineered landscape, that's the area that is actually worst hit. Every day something like the equivalent of 5 football fields is going underwater in the Mississippi Delta. And the people who live there are almost entirely either indigenous or black. This is also an area which is very important for the fossil fuel industry, So this is also an area which has terribly bad chemicals, chemical contamination across the landscape. Houston, one of the richest cities in the world, the 4th largest city in America, has been absolutely drowned 3 or 4 times in the last few years, we can see already the long-term effects on these landscapes. And I think there, it's really important to make the connection with our own cities, you know. Because, let's say, you know, one of the things that is so noticeable is that the colonial cities of India were built at almost exactly the same time as the big colonial cities of North America. Mumbai was founded in the same decade, the 1660s, as New York, you know.
And also re-engineered, as you said. I mean, would you like to just go back for a second? Sorry, I'm interrupting you. But you spoke about how the colonial settlers on the eastern coast of North America re-engineered large parts of the eastern states to resemble England. So New England, New York, New London. And they did so specifically, let's talk about New York, by reclaiming significant portions of lands to make the New York that we know today. Something similar was done to Mumbai as well.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, as we know, Mumbai in the 1660s, when the British first got Mumbai from the Portuguese as part of the dowry of Catherine of Braganza, Mumbai was 6 islands. You know, and the Portuguese had the common sense not to build on the islands. They actually made their base in Bassein, you know, Vasai, which is on the mainland. But the British decided to reclaim large parts of Mumbai, so they joined these 6 islands together over a period of, let's say, 100 years or so. Now, you know, these islands were reclaimed from the sea, but actually, you know, the water never gives anything up willingly. And these islands are going to go back to the sea. You know, one of the most important impacts of climate change is that the Arabian Sea is heating up incredibly fast. The Bay of Bengal is also heating up fast, but the Arabian Sea is heating up even faster. So cyclones are essentially heat engines. You will have noticed over the last 10 years, there have been many more cyclones in the Arabian Sea region. You know, last year, it was in 2021, just before Amphan hit Calcutta, there was a cyclone that was coming straight at Mumbai, you know, and it veered at the last minute. But you just think of what will happen if a major Category 4 or Category 5 cyclone hits Mumbai. Because, of course, New York is also very exposed to hurricanes, you know, to tropical storms. New York was devastated by Hurricane Sandy. But New York is relatively fortunate because it has barrier islands outside which protect it. You know, so even Staten Island is a kind of protection for New York. Mumbai has no protection at all. If a major cyclone were to come at Mumbai from traveling up the Indian Ocean, if it made a direct hit on Mumbai, it would be catastrophic. Because the most developed parts of Mumbai are all along the seashore. Now, usually when you have
it's prime real estate.
Exactly. Everyone who's rich in Mumbai wants a view of the sea. So, you know, these are the most dangerous parts of the city to be in fact. And they are the most exposed in the case of a cyclone hitting. The other problem is that Mumbai is connected to the mainland by two quite narrow roads. So usually cyclones are predicted ahead, but even if you had 5 days to prepare, you would not be able to evacuate Mumbai. It's not physically possible to evacuate 15 million people. And in fact, most middle-class people wouldn't leave because middle-class people have all their savings invested in their flat or in their car. You know, they don't want to leave their flat or their car and go. So they will be sitting ducks, absolutely sitting ducks for a major cyclone. You know, this is something I wrote about at great length in The Great Derangement. And one of the things I feel, you know, rather gratified about is that my book prompted a whole research project. Disaster management research project. So just at the most fundamental level, you know, we are not preparing for that future. You know, and that future is already here.
I think it's worrying that the land that we sit on as we speak is potentially in the path of a future hurricane or a future cyclone. And it's likely to be devastating as we witness in other parts of the world. And I don't think the outcome will be pretty, as you have, reiterated.
Yeah, because Mumbai represents an incredible concentration of risk. 40% of the country's trade goes through Mumbai. Mumbai has all the most important financial institutions in the country. The Mumbai Stock Exchange, the RBI, they're all here. And the Stock Exchange and RBI are actually in very low-level areas. So if there were to be a major flood or cyclone, they'll be completely, they'll be out of action, possibly for weeks.
So that's something that's likely to happen at some point in the future. What is happening as we speak right now is the unseasonal rise in temperature. Punjab temperature, Haryana temperature is already in the early 30s, which is devastating for the wheat crop. Wheat and its yield directly impacts our economic health. Wheat inflation can trigger a potential economic crisis for people living at the subsistence level, which is a significant proportion of our population. Now, do you want to talk about that, Dr. Ghosh? That we are sitting here right now when the predicted yield this year is likely to already be impacted. Wheat is green at this time of the year. It's supposed to start ripening in a few weeks from now, but the temperatures have already gone up. And everybody who comes from a wheat growing background is very worried, and so are people like Shankar Iyer. Is he here in the room? I think he's left. We were having this conversation yesterday. Economically, and those who look at economic forecasts of the country are equally worried. But I think the only people who are not worried are, probably the consumers, because they have no idea what's going on. So economists are worried. Farmers are worried. And it's happening right now as we speak. This unseasonal rise in temperature, the hottest February we have seen in 54 years. You talk about that.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, we are globally on the brink of a food crisis. Everybody knows that because, so far we've been protected also because of the grain reserves of countries like Russia, Ukraine, Canada and so on. But Canada has also been very badly hit in its major breadbasket regions. So absolutely, what you're saying is absolutely true. I mean, the Punjab has been very much disrupted, not only by climate change, but also by certain patterns of agriculture, So the Green Revolution was seen to be a huge boon at a certain point. Now it turns out to be one of those phenomena, the unintended consequences of which have been disastrous in the long run. So essentially what the Punjab farmers did, what was this great miracle was that they were given these genetically modified seeds and told to just pump up fossil water, and now
and lots of fertilizer, which was given as a result of subsidy, and free power for water.
Free power, so there was actually an incentive for farmers to just sit there and keep pumping up water from the aquifers. Now, the Upper Ganga aquifer is almost exhausted. I'm sure you've seen that in your part.
As a kid growing up in Malwa, which is where I hail from, water table in the mid-80s was 15, 20 feet. Today we are boring in Punjab, in my part of Punjab, at 250 feet. And we grow the world's most expensive basmati by climate cost, by economic cost, if one takes into account the free water for irrigation and, of course, the highly subsidized agricultural fertilizer. And the climate cost is what, is deeply worrying.
So you see, there's this vicious cycle that we are locked in. I mean, those fertilizers, those insecticides are all coming from fossil fuels.
And we're eating them back in the wheat we eat and consume. So most farmers they keep one patch of wheat where they don't use fertilizer and they don't use insecticides, and that's what we get ground from the local chakki, and we don't eat the rest of the wheat, which is what every farmer in Punjab and Haryana is doing. But I want to go back, Dr. Ghosh, to what you said about how we take short-term developmental calls, which ultimately, like in the case of the development around the Coastal Road project, like with everything, has disastrous long-term consequences. The green revolution, we were taught in schools, it was the best thing to have happened to us. And I think at that point, we needed it. We needed it because we were grain scarce. I mean, that's what we were taught. That was the narrative that was built. That it is for our future, we lack grain, we are food insufficient, and we need to grow more grain in terms of rice and wheat. And when we probably reached the level where, assuming that narrative was not flawed, we probably should have scaled back. Interestingly speaking, in the 60s, this area that I refer to did not grow wheat and rice. We don't even eat rice. We were made to grow this by agricultural scientists. There was constant seeding done from government intervention through radio programs, through television programs, talking about the benefits of these hybrid seeds that allowed for this kind of tall wheat grass, which is what we consume. Traditionally, original wheat is not this tall. But we were taught through programs like Krishi Darshan, which I saw every day at 6 o'clock living on the farm, that this is the way to be. And bajra, jawar was what was grown, pulses are what were grown, but now we only grow rice and wheat. And ironically, we don't eat rice. I want to reiterate that. Punjab, Haryana is not a rice staple place because that's not climatically what we are tuned for. Rice is meant for water-intensive, monsoon-driven places. But there was aggressive government intervention, good or bad, to make it happen. But I think the impact of that intervention was clear a long time ago. And we should have scaled back this push for rice and wheat for food grain. Can you talk about the role of government checks and balances in food security, in recalibrating the approach to agriculture, and thirdly, taking into account how they can do that with respect to climate change?
See, it's not just the government or the Indian government. It was part of a whole geopolitical thing because the Green Revolution was sponsored by the American state as a part of a Cold War contest with the Soviet Union.
It was their seeds as well.
It was absolutely, exactly. So now a lot of research has been done on the Green Revolution, and we know that it didn't actually feed billions, as it was said. I mean, that people were managing with their old techniques just as well. So, these things are always embedded within a sort of geopolitical context. That's the really hard part, because climate change itself is in some sense a geopolitical contest. It's a kind of war against the world's poor. That's really what it is.
It's what Radhika alluded to when she was introducing the session, that climate change is a full-scale war.
That's
with
right.
the developed nations fighting with the poorer nations to pass the buck.
That's right.
And to try and make their conscience probably clearer. But if I had to use the last few minutes of this session for actionables, because this has been a downer. And it's a downer we all needed to hear. This was not going to be a pleasant conversation. It is not something we can wish away. And I think the economic cost of climate change is going to rise day by day through sudden events like what we're seeing in Joshimath because of the aggressive amount of construction.
Yes.
And destruction of the ecosystem, the tunneling through mountains which destabilizes the whole ecosystem there. But I think the economic cost on day-to-day living. So there's death which comes at you suddenly through an unforeseen event like a cyclone or an earthquake, and then there is slow death, which is through starvation, because that's where we're heading. What are the actionables? If you had to pick two actionables that we should do, which each one of us can do and fight for, what would those two actionables be?
Well, they're all the usual sort of reduction of carbon footprint measures. But actually, there are many people in the country, there's a whole network of people in the country who are doing really important things at the grassroots level. And one of them, a man who I immensely admire, actually lives in Calcutta. His name is Debol Deb. He is a collector of seeds. He distributes various kinds of seeds, especially of rice. Drought-resistant rice, flood-resistant rice. He has these strains of rice which can literally grow under 6 feet of water for as long as a month. So when the Sundarban was badly hit by floods, he has salt-resistant varieties of rice. I think people like him really are the unsung heroes who are working at the grassroots level, and perhaps it's good that they're not so well known, because if they were well known, maybe the big agricultural companies would go after him and try and destroy the kinds of work he does, because these corporations are utterly ruthless.
And we know there's nothing known as compassionate capitalism. Thank you so much, Dr. Ghosh. This was a